Fellow Africans, good evening. My name is Edith. I'm a senior lecturer at the Thabo Mbeki African Institute. And I just want to make a disclaimer that if you're here and you think that you'll live here knowing who's a hero or knowing who, I'm not going to name, I'm just going to talk. And so you will name. I think I just want to provide a context for this talk and how I started thinking about this idea. I think as a young child, growing up in Soweto, Mletsane, my father was a hero. He was a hero for the mere fact that he was protecting me. He made sure that I have everything. He was always there for me. He used to carry me and protect me. And until one day when he came back home, and he didn't come back home for two nights. And I was worried, and I kept on asking as a young child. I think I was about 4 or 5. And when he came back with bruised legs. And I think I went to play, and when I came back, I found my mother using warm water and soap on trying to heal the wounds that were on him. And I asked, what's wrong, what happened? Nobody explained, but I figured out through eavesdropping from adult talk. You know, when we grow up, we used to listen to adult talk. It was the nicest thing that I liked, to listen to what adults are saying. And through that adult talk and my eavesdropping, I heard that my father was arrested for not carrying his permit or his dompas. And apparently he was beaten by police. This was how he was treated in prison. And I remember, and I still remember, even after this day, how I felt my father was, it's not working. How I felt that my father was not the hero that I thought he was. Because I thought he was capable of beating everyone. Because when I looked at him and I looked at the muscles, I thought he was the most powerful thing on earth. But that really disturbed me as a child. And as we grew up, as I entered into teenagehood, that's when I also see that my father, drank a lot. And as a teenager, his drinking used to bother me. And I was asking myself, what is happening to my hero? And should I see him less of a hero now that he's drinking, now that he was beaten by police? And that should also overshadow what has happened and how he has been there for me all over the time. And these were some of the questions. So here I'm trying to provide a context of what led to me trying to grapple about this. I teach at Yale, which is an American program, Young African Leaders Initiative. And throughout the cohorts, I started with the pilot. We are on our 5th cohort now. And every year, Yale brings in students from all over Southern Africa. And I offer a course on civic leadership within Yale. And every class that I've taught, I start by asking them, what are the likes? What is it that you like or that you dislike about Africa? Just to these young, aspiring African leaders. Every year, I would have a division of the likes and the dislikes. And in most cases, the likes are up to here, but the dislikes here. And that kept me wondering, is this how future young African leaders view themselves and view Africa? And if that is the case, I then became worried. We started reflecting on this with subsequent cohorts. And the common denominator on the dislikes has to do with leadership, African leadership. And I realized young African leaders are not happy with the current generation of leadership that we have. And So throughout these cohorts, we start talking about what is the problem. And the nice thing about the side of the likes that we have is that in the likes, you will get things like the climate, the landscape, the wildlife, fixed things that are, natural resources. On the dislikes, you find things that has to do with our social interactions. And that has to do with leadership in most cases. And it's quite interesting because what I do, I normally take pictures with my iPad. I normally take pictures of those likes and dislikes. And every time I compare them and I see a pattern that is emerging, that is the unhappiness, the dissatisfaction with leadership. And that is the context within which I'm trying to. So, and then we start to debate about quite a number of things around African leadership. As they always ask me, what is it about African leadership? What makes it distinct from other types of leadership? Why is it called African leadership? Even Obama, you are from an institute that calls African Leadership Institute. There is a yearly program as well. It talks about young African leaders. What makes them distinct? And these are some of the things that and the last context that I want to also bring here is a discussion with my own daughter, who was 10 years at the time. The first time she visited the Apartheid Museum, and she was walking down with me. And she asked me a question. Mom, is there any black hero who has not gone through pain and tribulation or shed some blood? And I started scratching because I was trying to find out who can I just bump this young woman with, who is a leader, who's a hero, who has not gone through tribulation, who has not gone through all these things, who has not shed blood. And I'm still scratching the surface because I can't even make a long list that can fill both my hands with that list. Perhaps it is my hope that this August forum today will help me answer some of these questions that I have. And in this talk, I chose to focus on the challenges of dominant concepts regarding how African leadership is perceived, is represented, and is portrayed in public and journalistic discourses. And this presentation actually seeks to reject the dominant discourse on African leadership that sees it in terms of political leadership. And such understanding for me is not helpful because it tends to focus on corrupt political leaders who abuse power, often without indicating that they also work with powerful corporate and multinational groups. And I will try also to emphasize the less recognized indirect leadership that we find in academia, in arts, in public, in community lives of people making a difference for so many people who we don't really acknowledge as leaders because we are obsessed with state power. And some of the questions that my students and I reflect on include, what is the nature of leadership within the African context? Does African leadership involve attention to some unique questions or issues? Should a discussion about African leadership provide space for raising questions about the nature of leadership in general? Perhaps maybe what are the behaviors and traits, the functions and the roles involved in African leadership, and what are the core competencies? To be honest with you, we have not even scratched the surface in terms of answering all of these questions. And as we continue with this journey, we will try to. Currently, the last cohort 5, is writing a book on their visions of African leadership, and it's going to come from all these different SADC countries. These young people are actually thinking and using their own case studies in their own countries. So I try to look for a definition of leadership, and it's really complex. And there is no agreement. Between 1990 and 2010, someone tried to look at published materials of what leadership is. and found 221 definitions of leadership in 1 decade. So as we stand here, you are not going to be provided with a definition of what leadership is. But one thing that I have is a working definition that I use, which involves a complex interaction between the leader, the followers, and the situation. And here I also want to invoke Heckman in 1996, who tried also to explain leadership in terms of characteristics, which he says leadership is about what you are. Here it talks about your character and your traits, characteristics and your traits, how you act, actions and behavior, what you do, your roles and functions when you are a leader, and how you work with others, interaction and collaboration and partnership that you follow with your followers and the situation that you come across. So we will use these broad themes just to understand what leadership, and within the context of leadership that I am talking about here. So as a leader, because I said we struggle to understand what is it that is unique about African leadership. And these are some of the things that comes out. As an African leader, it means you belong to a governing class that is a target of pillory, vilification, condemnation, and disdain due to pervasive and persistent socio-economic and political crisis. Sithole in 2004 talked about this. Also, you belong to a class of people whose predecessors tend to personalize power extensively. And you also belong to a class of people who deny its subjects fundamental human rights, where there is also widespread corruption. A class of people who is likely to be distant from the masses of the people. You also belong to a class of people that is unlikely to leave office voluntarily. You also belong to a class of people who tend to assume the state of leadership, either through military coups and other unwanted forms of taking over, recall or whatever you call it. And so that's how we try to rationalize what an African leader, how distinct is this person from other leaders. And when we focus on the constituency, who is your constituency? You are likely to lead a constituency that has been denied humanity over a long period of time, that they have even forgotten what it means to be human. You also belong to a constituency that you preside over what Fanon calls the wretched of the earth, the downtrodden masses with massive socio-economic and political crisis. You also lead a majority of people that could be construed as intellectually malnourished due to lack of literacy on the current systems of governance. And also, you operate within an environment that lacks the institutions to prepare leadership or with a global outlook. You also are likely to operate within an environment that lacks access to relevant and timely and adequate information. So you are also operating in a domain that has been characterized by huge external debt overhang, net capital flight, disinvestment, collapse of social infrastructure, food crisis and insecurity, overdevalued national currency, pervasive poverty, unpopular, repressive, and alienating economic policies. So in a nutshell, I have come to the conclusion that you operate within a very crooked room. To use what Harris Perry's used, it's a phrase that he used in the book that is called Sister Citizen. He used this analogy within a feminist methodology. When she speaks of the crooked room here, this theory was developed within a cognitive psychology of field dependence. Here, what Melissa teaches us is that in a cricket room, you place subjects in a chair that is crooked, in a room that is crooked, and you request your subjects to align themselves vertically. So the result of this experiment, which was done, shows that some of these subjects, they view themselves as straight only in relation to their surrounding. Secondly, some could be tilted as much as 35 degrees. You know what 35, what's 35 degrees? This is the 45, right? This is the 45. Is the 45, is that the 45 or the 90? 90. This is the 45. Maybe 35 is even lower than 45, right? So you could tilt the chair, and then your subjects will report that they were perfectly straight, simply because they were aligning themselves with images that were equally tilted. The third one, some subjects, they managed to get themselves more or less upright, regardless of how crooked the surroundings images were. So that this theory is relevant in this case, in the sense that when confronted with coloniality, which I call the crooked room in this particular case, and by coloniality here I mean the invisible power structures that continue to sustain domination and exploitation long after direct colonialism has passed. So when you are confronted with that coloniality, you tend to stand up in a cricket room, and you are trying to figure your way, which way is up. And because you are bombarded with these warped images of your own humanity, so some of these African leaders, they tilt and bend themselves to fit the distortion of corrupt monsters. What are the other names that we use to describe African leaders, apart from what? Dictators, whatever you can call them. So that is the case. So some of these African leaders, they tilt in ways that accommodating the degrading stereotypes about themselves. So I think what is needed is for us to appreciate the structural constraints that influence their behavior. We need to acknowledge them, because it can be hard to stand up straight in a crooked room. So such groups as well, they tend to suffer misrecognition as a result of stereotypes or stigma. And I think you can think of where you are working in relation to other workers and how people see you. It doesn't have to be our political leaders only. You can be a vice chancellor of a university. The same thing, you could find yourself in a crooked room, because the structural constraints that are there are going to prevent you from operating as you wish. So systems somehow don't offer its citizens equal opportunities for public recognition. So the question then becomes, based on this situation that is depicted here, what are then the prerogatives for conferment of a hero status in the African context? Because then it would seem few African leaders would fit this kind of definition, or this kind of context that I have provided. And when do they become sellouts? When do heroes become sellouts? Are they like my father, who was once a hero, and along the way, I personally make him lose his status of heroship? And when I grow up later and I realize how he was working within a crooked room, I understand what the issues are. So African leaders are described as heroes in many cases for their sacrifice that they have made during the liberation struggle, when they show courage when faced with problems, when they help others to go through difficulties, when they act regardless of whether scared or not. Some heroes remain unappreciated during their lifetime until they are older. Until we are older and we start reflecting on their life, we can also recognize that they are heroes. And someone who is not afraid, to act and do things despite having no consent from the majority. And someone who also take a stand for something when everyone else lacks the courage to do so. And a hero also becomes someone who believes in something greater than himself and stand up for what he believes, even in the face of great odds. So in this context, when do they become sellouts? So they become sellouts when they betray their principle for reasons of expedience. Then we tend to label them as sellouts. When their ideas contradict with their actions, when they fail to live up to the cause they fought for, when they fail to exercise their power and influence while in leadership position. So this is normally how we judge African leaders in African context. And when they fail actually to change the lives of the majority of poor people while in power. So in many cases, we tend to label them as heroes. So what we need to understand is that the modern colonial world we live in apply inconsistent standards to aspects of leadership and heroism. So we need to be careful, because a leader in Africa, a leader in Europe are not viewed in similar ways. Because some of us, we belong to a predecessor of leaders who have distorted images and distorted perception and negative perception of who they are. So the opportunist manner in which we praise the living and when we ridicule the dead as well, that's what happens. And also we also tend to ascribe heroism, to confer heroism, to rely on those few highly opinionated in the forms of academia and media in the public space, who tend to hijack public discourse by casting dispersions. Sometimes it's good and it's necessary, they must do it. But we need also to step back and reflect. And I think it's important that they do it because they help us to reflect on what leadership should epitomize consistently. As a consistent phenomenon, we need to think and reflect on it constantly, so that we don't relax on who is a leader for Africa. So somehow heroism becomes a subject of how one is affected by such leadership, rather than how such leadership should affect the environment where they find themselves. So we tend to ascribe heroism to how we are affected. I don't think those who are incorporated into the patronage systems of our African leaders will see them as not heroes. They will point to certain people as heroes because of what they have done for them, rather than how they have changed the situation of the crooked rooms that they found themselves in. So if the previous generation of leadership did not usher us a better life for all in Africa, what is it that are we doing as current leaders now? What is it that prevents us to gain the things that we are complaining that they have not reached or they have not done 1, 2, 3? They failed here and here. We are still here, we are alive, we still have the energy. What is it that is preventing us to come with superior ideologies and superior practice that will advance Africa? So sometimes in the African context, revolutionary fighters liberate their own people, only to be overwhelmed by global power systems. So on that note, I have a question. Is it possible for these leaders to ascend to heroism in the current global order or disorder? I thank you.